All right, joining us now, Bryan Fischer, staff writer, Sports Illustrated, covers college football, college hoops, but overall good dude. Bryan, kind enough to hang out with us. Bryan, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Good to be on with you guys.
Always good catching up. The evil empire known as the SEC holding their media day, led by Darth Vader himself, Greg Sankey, who said, hey, look, it's not just idle conversation of us breaking away. We'll do it if we need to. Is he bluffing, or is the SEC actually thinking that it may actually come to that?
Deep down, I think it's a pretty standard bluff, from the SEC and Greg Sankey. But to be fair, I think it's not just the commissioner himself. He is speaking for a lot of his member schools, which let's face it, I think there's been more agitation from a lot of his members to actually kind of go out and do some of these things and at least create some rules that govern just the SEC. And I think there is certainly a broader point in terms of, hey, this is a way that we can get around some of the lawsuits and some of the antitrust litigation that has been going on, surrounding a lot of NCAA rules. And this is a way to do that. But as far as actually breaking away, I think that's still a little bit premature here.
A lot of obviously hope for the legislation that's being talked about, and I think the majority of fans through this Texas Tech situation, Scotty and I were talking about this the other day, have definitely kind of galvanized. They galvanized against that anyway. Do you feel like this, even with these statements, do you feel like this is a deal that could get done in the foreseeable future because of just the need to take the next step?
I will believe it when I see it, and I've kind of had that kind of same outlook throughout this entire process. And part of that is just because kind of where we are in the calendar. We're coming up on the August recess in Congress, and I think if they're not able to get something done here really in the next week and a half, and really to get through both houses of Congress at this point, to send to the president's desk, I think it's going to be looking like a very long summer and long fall after a lot of lobbying efforts there in Washington, D.C. And there's still some back and forth in terms of some of the language, coming out of the Senate, which hopefully, there's some hope that this will actually go to the floor, which I think would be a pretty meaningful step. But I think it's just in terms of the actual pressure that is going to be on now to get over the hump in terms of actually getting something through both houses. I think it's going to be too much, at this point. And I think there's been some productive dialogue, from everybody, and some of the changes that certainly the Big Ten and the SEC would like are maybe not going to be completely implemented, but are going to get at least to where they can get enough broad support. But at the end of the day, I think politics is just so difficult to predict nowadays, given how divided things are in Washington, D.C. To layer on that some of the issues that we're seeing in college athletics, again, I will believe it when I see it, despite some positive signs, at least in the near term.
So here in Salt Lake City, Kentucky football isn't necessarily a prime topic of conversation, but the Will Stein line yesterday where he said, was asked why Kentucky will be good, he's like, well, because of me. I'm the guy that's going to get the – I mean, I like the honesty, but that certainly was the quote of the day yesterday with the dude's not hurting for confidence.
No, and good for Will, and that's just kind of who he is too. He is a very confident guy, and you kind of have to be, to be a quarterback. Certainly, playing the ACC, there at Louisville, tremendous guy, and he's got a history of success. I think it's understandable that you would have some confidence going into this job, given what he's been able to do, especially at the quarterback position. There at Oregon, UTSA before that. He's a guy that does bring quite a bit of experience. It's just like can he kind of get over the hump? And I will say, to his credit, there's the Indiana factor, I think, is going to be great there at Kentucky in terms of, look, they right up the road, they did it. They got over the hump. And I'm not saying that Kentucky's going to go out and win a national title or anything, but in terms of being competitive in the SEC, we've seen that from Kentucky before. In this day and age, it really is as good as, your roster from year to year. It's not like, you're building slowly up, for 4 or 5 years to maybe have one good season. You can have, a couple good years, and, credit to Will. I think he's a confident guy. He's going to certainly supercharge that offense there. It's just going to be, in a very brutal SEC with that extra conference game. I think it's going to be an uphill battle for really all of the schools that are not spending, $40 or $50 million, which I don't believe Kentucky is, this year.
Well, it is, you bring up the interesting point with Indiana. I think that all of a sudden Indiana is set a lot of shockwaves throughout college football. Even if you don't have a stellar tradition of football excellence, if you get the right coaching and the right roster, you can turn things around pretty quickly. And I think that probably sets the bar high for a lot of schools, even if they don't necessarily are considered a blue blood in that sport.
Yeah, and I was talking with Coach last week at ACC Media Days. Like the margins right now, they're always pretty thin. To begin with, given you're relying on 18 to 24-year-olds. But I think just because depth is almost non-existent, like injuries play a huge factor. The games are just tougher, and talent has just spread around. I mean, you look at the 5 stars. They're not all concentrated in 3 or 4 schools anymore. Like that is getting spread out. You're definitely seeing talent. You're definitely seeing playing time. Be a pretty big factor for a lot of guys, even over some paychecks. And so I think it's just a new era, in terms of the sport and adjusting to that. And I think it does kind of put the emphasis back on actual coaching. I think that's the big thing, for a lot of people. Yes, you are having GMs deal with the rosters, and you have your slew of personnel folks that are designed to get as many guys in the door that can be cost efficient as well as produce. But at the end of the day, it does come down to those margins, and whether it's the Big 12, the ACC, the SEC, the Big 10, really doesn't matter the league. You're going to come down to a couple of close calls there in the fourth quarter, kind of deciding whether you're going to have a really great season or you're maybe just a good one.
Another big piece of news this week across college football, certainly impacts college football, is the Ward Manuel's going to step down at Michigan. Obviously read your article, which I really enjoyed. If y'all want to catch that, jump out to SI.com. Brian wrote a great article about it. But Brian, Kyle Whittingham's going to have a new boss.
Yeah,
real quick.
I'm sure he probably didn't necessarily foresee that, but I don't think it would have dissuaded him from taking a job like Michigan. And that's also kind of part of the attractiveness. I think of having Kyle there, to having somebody who's established, who's laid the groundwork for the program to provide some stability. I always thought that this was one of the better jobs to come open in terms of, if you're an athletic director out there, taking off all the boxes. Yes, you're going to get paid well. Yes, it's one of those Power 2 schools. Yes, it's a great place to live there in Ann Arbor, especially if you have a family. Plus the stability of not really knowing that you're not going to have to worry about football really the next couple of years, outside of fundraising and making sure those NIL rosters opportunities are there for the roster. I think it's a great setup for whoever comes in and replaces Ward Manuel, which as I kind of wrote, it was time, certainly to make this move. And I think he did a terrific job in terms of being able to skate on thin ice and survive over a decade there in Ann Arbor. But at the end of the day, probably a much needed change and kind of going to go through a reboot, there, in Michigan.
Was it a foregone conclusion that he was gone and they just needed the investigation to kind of give them a little bit of ammunition, or was there probably some pretty damning stuff in that investigation that led them to this?
Well, I think if there had been a smoking gun, you certainly would have seen, the school move to actually have something more, a little formal from last Thursday's board meeting. And look, I mean, like I said, Ward's been on thin ice and had come close or rumored to possibly be stepping away or getting fired really for the last couple of years. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of for as much as he's turned around Michigan and we that was one of the more underachieving athletic departments certainly before he got there. Win a football national title, to win a men's basketball national title, like that does count for a lot there. But at the end of the day, there's just so many scandals, so many off-field things that it was definitely time. And the fact that there wasn't going to be a new president, they have an interim guy right now. They're going to hire somebody, and at some point, it just kind of seems like time. And I think regardless of what was actually in the report, which we all don't know about because that was all delivered verbally, to a lot of regents and lacking transparency there. I think it just was a nice, convenient cover to say, all right, let's separate, let's go our separate ways, and let's embark on a new search.
Scotty and I went down to Media Days, Big 12, a couple weeks ago. Had a great visit. Really impressed with a bunch of teams. We had TCU on yesterday. Talked to Brian Estridge and their quarterback. The situation's fascinating. Kid at Harvard. What do you know about him and his story?
Oh, yeah, Jaden Craig, certainly a terrific story, and like that kind of speaks to modern college football nowadays, right? Where you can get a guy coming out of Harvard, and look, he was somebody that, frankly, had he not been able to come back for another year, if he just left and gone to the NFL, I think he probably would have been maybe a late day 3 pick, at this point. So, he's got the inherent talent. I think, talking with Sonny Dykes too a couple weeks ago, he's excited, in terms of the offensive system change that they're going to have. Like, they're going to get back to running the football a little bit more. I think they've definitely kind of got away with it under the previous offensive coordinator. So I think TCU overall, they're one of those teams that I think, sneaky good, in the Big 12. Obviously, had a terrific season last season. If you look at it objectively, probably lost a couple of games that could have made it even better. But that's kind of just the nature of the Big 12. And to bring in a quarterback who's a veteran guy, I think that the thing that struck me too in talking with some of the Horned Frogs out there at Big 12 Media Days as well is just he's ingratiated himself, right away. He's the leader on the team. He's one of those guys that has jumped right in terms of that leadership ability. And you can't expect anything other than a smart guy coming from Harvard, trying to adjust there. He's made the most of it. And I'm excited to see him and what he does with his kind of new look TCU this season.
Kind of feels like Texas Tech and BYU are 1A and 1B in that conference. And then you've got that next tier that's got Houston, Utah, Arizona State, TCU. Who out of that next tier of teams do you think really has a realistic opportunity of playing in a Big 12 championship game?
Oh, spin the wheel,
yeah.
It really does kind of come down to, who's going to win those, game or two in the fourth quarter. That is going to prove key in terms of winning the tiebreakers. And I think it's probably even more difficult for members of that group, unless they get some of those head-to-head wins with BYU and Texas Tech, just because, frankly, BYU and Texas Tech not playing each other. That could be potentially good for the league in terms of maybe getting another team into the conference title game and letting a potential at-large bid out there for the CFP. But it's going to be tough for all of them. And I would say if I had to pick one, it probably would be TCU, just because we have seen proof positive that Sonny Dykes can get a team over the line. I do think they feel really good about where they're at. In terms of their depth, especially up front in both sides of the ball. I think they're, going to replace some new guys in the secondary. That's probably a little bit of a concern for the defensive staff. But, I think they've got enough there to maybe be that team that emerges out of the group. I wouldn't put it past, ASU. We've seen proof positive from them as well under Kenny Dillingham. I think they might actually be a year away, but, you never know with that group. Certainly Arizona, and with Noah Fafita coming back, Brent Brennan, probably one of the bigger surprises in the Big 12 last season. He's even more excited about his team than he was a year ago. So it really is, again, spin the wheel. That's just the nature of the Big 12, and probably will be the nature of this conference title race, which figures to be one of the more exciting ones in the country this year.
Your take on the time you spent, I assume you spent a little time with Morgan Scalley, you got to listen to him at the podium, but your thoughts of Morgan, and, I saw the other day he shut off his social media. It's time to go down into the cave. So he's approaching year one. What was your take for Media Day, and what do you have expectation-wise from Morgan?
Yeah, I think in terms of the latter question and in terms of expectation, I don't really think they change. And I think Morgan would probably be the first to say that, and he kind of alluded to it. Yes, there's some new things, some small, tweaks here or there, but in terms of, the culture of the program, in terms of what they want to accomplish, in terms of how they're built, in terms of the guys they have, I don't think really any of that changes. And yes, there's a new guy in the head coach's office, for the first time in a long time, but obviously with Morgan, I think just you could feel the love for the place and the understanding of what it takes to win there at Utah, what it takes to succeed there. Like he knows that better than just about anybody. So I think that's definitely one of the teams. It might be even rocky here or there, in terms of maybe coaching decisions that you just never know about as a first-time head coach. But I think the program itself is definitely in a healthy position, and I know he's excited to kind of put his firm, fingerprints on it. And, that's not to say he's going to change a bunch of things from what Kyle was doing. But, I think he's excited to kind of get all that behind him and really focus on this season. Like you said, turn off the social media and all that. He's a 1A football type of guy. And I know he's going to love nothing more than actually getting into fall camp this year or later this month and really getting into the weed work in terms of building this team for this season.
Knowing what you know now about how the Brandon Sorsby situation played out, had you ranked Utah and BYU and Texas Tech in the Big 12, who would you have number one and who would you have number two?
I would still keep Texas Tech at number one, and I think maybe that's just talking with Joey McGuire a little bit a couple weeks ago. Obviously, I understand the emphasis on the Brendan Sorsby thing, but having Will Hammond back, and I think they do feel pretty confident in terms of where he's at, health wise. I think they might take it even slower, probably than maybe the external expectation is. I know a lot of people are circling that Houston game, but even if they were to kind of hold them back a little bit and maybe a little bit deeper into the actual conference play, I think they're still fine. I think if you look at the actual, top to bottom of the roster, I would kind of put, like you said earlier, 1 and 1A in terms of Texas Tech and BYU, but it'd probably still be in that order. Now, that can obviously change, quite a bit in terms of injuries and all that. But I think just in terms of the actual frontline talent, they feel really good about their running backs there in Lubbock. I think they're probably going to get better production out of their wide receivers this year. So, if you're talking about, quarterback being a little bit more of a point guard, this year in terms of Will Hammond, I think they can get that out of him, and he can still make the big plays that we saw, at times, in flashes last season. So Tech would still be the number one, but it does feel much closer, I think, and I think, Kalani Sitake, talking to him as well, they feel like the playbook is opening up more a little bit offensively, confident in where they're at defensively, of course, and I think it's going to be a really fun race, in the Big 12 yet again.
Who do you look at as a team in college football period that maybe we're not talking about, but that we probably will come in December, January?
Oh, that's a good question. I almost want to circle USC a little bit, both good and bad, because I think you can see that they've been laying the groundwork for this to be one of those seasons. And there's talk of obviously Jaden Maiava being a potential Heisman guy. The pressure is definitely on there with Lincoln Riley, but they've got that game early, against Oregon in the Coliseum early in the season. That's going to be one everybody's going to be circled on. But they got to go to Penn State. They got Indiana. This is a pretty tough Big Ten schedule, and I think the pressure is definitely on there with Lincoln Riley. So yes, we're going into Big Ten Media Days next week, and I'm sure there will be a lot more talk about USC. But that to me, that whole situation, both good and bad, whether they surprise and get into the playoff or whether they disappoint and kind of fall short of expectations, the Trojans are definitely one of the more interesting teams, I think, in college football this season. We'll probably see that play out both on and off the field moving forward. I
mean, we talk about the drama inside the athletic department at Michigan, but take all that out of it. Just looking at that coaching staff and looking at that talent that they have on that roster, what are your expectations for the Wolverines this season?
Well, it's really going to come down to, I think they got a pretty high floor, right? In terms of, this is a team that probably could blink and go 8-4, and it is a pretty tough schedule. Obviously, we'll see what happens in terms of those big time games against Indiana and Ohio State that are on there. That'll really be where the new coaching staff is going to be tested. But this is a team full of guys that they got to come back from last season. And obviously, a new coaching staff. It's going to really. I think a lot of pressure is going to be on there on Jason Beck, their new offensive coordinator, in terms of getting Bryce Underwood. The talent is there. It is. I've seen it. We've seen flashes. Can he be more consistent? We saw that out of Eric Dampier there at Utah, last season. He definitely improved his numbers, even making that jump from the Group of Five up to the Power Four. Can we see a similar kind of jump from Bryce Underwood? That's going to be key to Michigan. And I kind of see them being one of those teams that really floats around the college football playoff discussion. And certainly they've got that big win against Oklahoma. They'll have to be well prepared and ready early in the season, because that's a big mile marker, not just in terms of Michigan themselves and where the program is at under Kyle Early, but also in terms of that kind of Big Ten SEC race where you figure one of those conferences that's going to be one of those key metric points in terms of comparing the two leagues and who might get that extra playoff bid between the two of them.
Well, hey, we appreciate it, Brian. Great stuff as always. Enjoy Big Ten Media Day coming up next week, because I think there's going to be some fascinating stuff coming out of there. But always a pleasure. We'll talk soon.
Absolutely. Good to be on with you guys.
From Sports Illustrated, Bryan Fischer. Follow him on Twitter at Brian D. Fisher right here on 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone.